So back into The Year of Dreaming Dangerously by Slavoj Zizek. I am going to be interpreting these chapters, chapter 2 and 3 for this week, with an eye to really trying to understand some of the basics of Zizek's perspective and his theory and what it might mean for us today. And so I'm going to be looking at two chapters. The second chapter in the book, which is called From Domination to Exploitation and Revolt, and the third one, which is The Dream Work of Political Representation. These go together really well. As we know, Zizek is a Marxist, but he's a Marxist of a unique kind. So he's not a slavish devotee of Marx, trying to stay as close to an original interpretation of Marx as he possibly can, but rather he is trying to use Marx's theory to develop his own. And so we find in these two chapters that he does distance himself from orthodox readings of Marx in multiple ways. Probably the biggest way is that he brings in psychology, and he, as I said last time, is very inspired by the psychological theory of Jacques Lacan. So that gives us a clue that Zizek is not a complete materialist, right? That he's not somebody who thinks that all we have to do is look at the material relations, the technology, what it produces, how it's made, and the class structure that comes out of that. Zizek is about something more and different than that. He's not a dogmatist. He says near the beginning, we must get rid of the last vestiges of Marx's evolutionary historicism, even if it appears to be the very foundation of Marxist orthodoxy. I think it's safe to say that Zizek always wants to knock down orthodoxy because it gets in the way of being able to think straight as we become kind of religious about ideological purity or theoretical consistency. Towards the end of the third chapter, he states that Marx was wrong to think that the state was just about class exploitation, and that if class exploitation went away, you wouldn't have a state. He says he didn't anticipate, because of this, Stalinism. So Zizek is not one to think that the state is going to disappear or should disappear, and he's one to think that we need to actually think about how we want to structure society, not just think that it's going to unfold according to some evolutionary plan. In From Domination to Exploitation, that chapter, he talks about the ways that capitalism has changed since Marx's time. He makes three interesting points in a unique way. He says, first of all, in our time, we have this control of common knowledge. The control of common knowledge has increasingly become a factor in making money. Now, this is my language, by the way. He uses the language common knowledge, but a lot of what I'm going to say here is me translating Zizek's language into something that I can understand better and that hopefully you can understand better. When he uses the term common knowledge, I think he might be saying that knowledge ought to be in common. In other words, that, there's a normative element here, I think, where he's saying that, with the increasing control of knowledge, for instance, a concrete example of this would be in patents, right, and copyrights. If that's being increasingly controlled for the sake of profit, it is, in effect, holding people back from being able to innovate as well as they would. So our time is characterized by that control of common knowledge to make a profit. It's also characterized by a control of common natural resources, same sort of thought there, that has increasingly become a major source of profit. So think land, for instance, waterways. Those who can dominate those natural resources for a profit exclude others. And then going along with those two, he says, a new class, the, quote, salaried bourgeoisie, has emerged. Now, it's not that Marx might not have known that these were coming about or that he couldn't have anticipated them, but that they are full-blown at this point, and they characterize the economy in a way that Zizek seems to think Marx couldn't have fully understood. So he's going to go a lot into this idea of the so-called salaried bourgeoisie, or the salaried middle class, if you want. He says in our economy now, intellectual and service labor, which he also calls immaterial labor, have usurped industrial labor, which of course Marx would not have been able to anticipate. Intellectual labor, teacher, doctor, lawyer, accountant, manager, service labor, all the people who clean things, care for children, serve you food, drive you around. That's all immaterial labor. It doesn't produce a concrete physical commodity. Here's a quote. He says, for immaterial production, the products are no longer material objects, but new social or interpersonal relations themselves. In short, immaterial production is directly biopolitical. It is the production of social life. Well, that's a neat way to look at it. It's true. We don't normally think of it this way, but all of these various services that people are providing in order to make a living are very much social services. Caring for human beings, feeding them, clothing them, transporting them, providing them with a social life through entertainment, making sure they're organized, making sure they have great mental health. In a previous era, many of these things would have been done by ourselves, or other people in our family or community would have done them for us without being paid. So that's a huge change, that this intellectual / service labor has risen up as the primary way in which most people stay afloat in our economy. And then he highlights the effect of highly sophisticated forms of communication. And he more or less says, you know, the communists missed the boat. They thought of these emerging ways of communication like radio and then television and then the internet potentially as ways of propagandizing people, but they didn't realize that capitalism would be able to do this much more effectively because all those forms of communication be integrated into the capitalist system so easily, not only through advertisement, but through entertainment and through branding and so many ways. So the constant messages across the board go along so well with the economic system. He says it produces a, quote, frictionless capitalism, a system in which there is no overt propaganda, but in which the information serves as a way of smoothing the gears better than it would have if it were overt propaganda in a communist or other totalitarian setting. Next, as Zizek talks about the so-called white-collar proletariat, he has already mentioned that a new salaried bourgeoisie has risen up, and he makes the point here, the new salaried bourgeoisie, it doesn't own anything or control anything. Unlike the bourgeoisie of Marx, where they were the factory owners, the bankers, and so on, the salaried bourgeoisie, it makes its living off of that salary, not off of any property ownership. And it sits in between those who are simply working class people and those who quote, own the means of production. You get the sense that Zizek thinks that if they saw reality the way it really is without the propaganda, that they would see themselves as a sort of proletariat, being exploited relative to the people who actually own the enterprises that they work for. And then, interestingly, he talks about how they are divided into the upper and the lower levels of bourgeoisie. The upper, think middle or upper middle class, as we might say, and the lower level of bourgeoisie, which he calls the proletarianized bourgeoisie. But he says that the upper level bourgeoisie receive a, quote, surplus wage. He uses that term repeatedly, and he says the work that they do is not more valuable than the work of the lower bourgeoisie, but it divides the two, so they don't have as much in common. The upper bourgeoisie are politically empowered. They know how to use the political system effectively. They can protest, in a sense, in order to gain the things they want out of the political system, whether that's, some tax break or some service, or because they identify with the corporations that employ them, it might mean benefits to their employers so that they can continue to have their jobs. But these upper bourgeoisie, the upper salaried people, may look at those below them as, having no or less ability to rise up to their level because of being too stupid or lazy or some such thing as that. So the upper level manager might look at his secretary and think, well, she could be in my position if she just had my brains or my drive, and so she could get the kind of education I got, etc. And so I deserve to make a lot more money. But however, if we take a look at what the secretary is actually doing, we'll see that without the secretary doing most of the managerial stuff in the office, probably her boss wouldn't be able to get his job done. So which of those two is providing the more valuable labor? But he gets the surplus wage. And they see each other as two different classes, but neither one of them owns anything. So this becomes a theme really in Zizek's chapters here, divide and conquer basically. So then he turns to the global economy. This too is new. You know, Marx kind of anticipated that capitalism would spread around the globe, but he couldn't really understand exactly what form it was going to take. How much of it would be driven by finance? The salaried bourgeoisie have grown and grown because corporate production has grown. And corporate production has grown as it has gone global, because it can avail itself of cheap labor and resources in other countries and can go wherever it takes to get the best tax advantage, the best labor costs, and so on. The corporate headquarters can be located anywhere, but lots of times if it's located in the United States, there's a lot of people working for it there, and they are indirectly, or rather directly, benefiting from the global nature of their enterprise. And he starts to point out that even in the United States, where the country has a trade deficit and where a lot of people take on a lot of debt, and so more and more of their resources flow out of the country in order to buy the things that they want and need, the salaried bourgeoisie and those above them with a surplus wage, well, they profit, as well as the people who, the stockholders who own the corporation, profit and are getting richer despite the fact that their country has trade deficits and despite the fact that so many people are in debt. Trade deficits, he says, and personal debt are not a problem for Wall Street because it still reaps the profits bolstered by the use of cheap foreign labor and commodities. But towards the end of chapter 2, he says that this scene can't go on forever. And as a matter of fact, though American society can buy up a lot of stuff, he says the U.S. is an empire in decline. Its growing negative trade balance demonstrates that it is an unproductive predator. It has to suck up a daily influx of $1 billion from other nations to pay for its consumption, and is as such the universal Keynesian consumer that keeps the world economy running. You know, and he says it's a military power, but it's really not an economic power in this situation. It needs other countries more than they need the United States at this point, he says. And then he turns to politics as dream work. This is where his psychology comes into play. He asks the question, why are people such as the under and unemployed, the precarious service workers, the lower bourgeoisie and the upper bourgeoisie pitted against each other in a culture war instead of seeing what they have in common? This section reminded me of books like What's the Matter with Kansas or Strangers in Their Own Land. I covered that one a while ago. Or Hillbilly Elegy. Why do we have people on these cultural sides fighting against each other? And of course the classic Marxist question is, why don't they see that their economic interests are in common, that they have more in common than what they think divides them? So he goes into this interesting theory of politics as dream work, or the displacement of class consciousness. Where did class consciousness go? In other words, well, it went into what I would call ideologies. He doesn't use that term, but again, I'm trying to sort of interpret this in a way that I can understand, hopefully you can understand better. For instance, the ideology of helping the rich, he says, because they are the source of jobs. In other words, those who would maybe normally see themselves as exploited identify with the rich because they are the engine of prosperity. And so they side with them to the point of defending their right to be, to not be taxed, for instance, or to be propped up by government if necessary. Then there's the ideology of blaming a third party, Jews, immigrants, minorities of all sorts, leading to right-wing populism. And then there's the ideology of the PC versus the anti-PC folks, the social justice warriors versus the ordinary folks that feel oppressed by them. These ideologies represent displacement, according to Zizek. He makes this analogy. He says, just as in some post-socialist Eastern European countries, the tension between pseudo-folk and rock functioned as a displacement of the tension between the nationalist conservative right and the liberal left, so, currently, there are multiple dream works that displace the natural class antagonisms onto others. Here's a quote. He says, in other words, the economic class opposition, poor farmers and blue-collar workers versus lawyers, bankers, and large companies, is transposed or coded into the opposition between honest, hard-working Christian Americans and the decadent liberals who drink lattes and drive foreign cars, advocate abortion and homosexuality, mock patriotic sacrifice and the simple provincial way of life, and so on. And he does like to say "and so on" a lot. He says the enemy is thus perceived as the liberal who, through federal state intervention, from school busing to prescribing that Darwinian evolution and perverse sexual practices be taught in class, wants to undermine the authentic American way of life. This is our dream politics, he says. Meanwhile, the real politics of class struggle, meaning just the interests of different classes, economic interests of different classes in society, is negated or sort of obscured by this dream politics. I love this. He says, it is the ultimate irony of history that radical individualism serves as an ideological justification for the unconstrained power of what the vast majority experience as an anonymous force that, without any democratic public control, regulates their lives. That would be the economy. And I think he rightly points out that the right-wing populists are fighting a war that cannot be won. It's a perpetual war. Because if they did win it, he argues, we'd have a political and economic meltdown. If we got, somebody trying to bring about the Handmaid's Tale, we'd have some sort of revolution. And stuff wouldn't be sold, and stuff like that is dangerous to the system, so we can't have that. He's got a little bit of conspiratorialism here. I don't know, like he says that the ruling class allows the moral war because it keeps the lower classes busy and therefore disarms them. That's probably not a conscious thing, and I bet he would say it isn't even a conscious strategy, but it coexists, let's put it that way, with this anti-PC moral war, because it really doesn't stop the ruling class from doing what it wants to do, and it keeps people who would otherwise maybe criticize them from being able to do that. And of course, there's this great irony that the politically correct liberals are pitted against the very class that they've claimed to help, the lower classes and the poor, because those lower classes are so not PC. He gives an example here on page 33. He says, for example, the feminist struggle can be articulated into a chain with the progressive struggle for emancipation, or it can, as it certainly often does, function as an ideological tool with which the upper middle classes assert their superiority over the patriarchal and intolerant lower classes. So the ultimate ironic displacement is politically correct liberalism. And wow, that's really an unbelievably helpful way of looking at it, actually. PC liberalism is actually a dream representation of class dominance, the dominance of the upper bourgeoisie against the lower proletarianized bourgeoisie, the lower white-collar workers, and the working class. It's a function of that divide and conquer strategy. So his analysis is kind of classically Marxist, but also not, because it involves these psychological factors and political factors. He ends that third chapter with this really unsettling thought that the new Christian fundamentalist populism is the new red attitude in disguise, meaning the new left-wing impulse in disguise. Red being the color of American conservatives on the map, but red also being the traditional color of communism. Now, he's not saying that they're all secretly communists. Instead, he's saying that this new right-wing populism has at its base a gut-level instinctual dissatisfaction of the state of affairs of lower white-collar workers and the working class and the poor, and these people have fallen for displacement. I suspect that Zizek thinks that those people are fertile ground, that the reason why they turn towards the right-wing populism is because it is what is speaking to them. Anyway, we'll have more time to speculate about things as time goes by. So there you go. There's my first serious stab at understanding Slavoj Zizek.